Hello, this is Dr. Robert Guthrie again. It's a pleasure to be back with you all to continue our series from the Sunday School at Jerome United Methodist Church here in Dublin, Ohio. And we're going through our New Testament lessons week by week because with the COVID pandemic, we really can't safely meet. And so at this point, we're going to do two of Paul's letters. We've been working our way through Paul's letters as we go through the New Testament. And we're going to do two of them. The first is Philemon. Philemon is very short, one chapter. And it's a very personal letter, very different than many of the other letters. It's a letter written from Paul to one person, not to a church, not to a congregation, just to one person. The date is unclear. It feels to me later in his ministry, but that's an opinion. You know, these are not facts. These are opinions. We don't really know when it was written. We don't even know where it was written. He clearly describes himself as in chains in one of his many imprisonments. He was imprisoned many times. He ended up in prison in Rome. I doubt that this is written from Rome, because from Rome all the way to Colossae, which is where Philemon is, that's a long way. He probably was in prison in Ephesus or over in the Greek areas. Ephesus is on the west coast of Turkey. Colossae is inland from there, 70 or 80 miles, which is a good trip in those days. And then he could have been in the Macedonia area or in Greece across the way. He was in prison many times, even if it's not recorded in Acts. There's kind of a 3-year gap in Acts where you don't have a lot of specifics about him, and he was always getting locked up for various reasons, and he just hung in there. So it's a very personal letter. And what he's doing in this is he is sending back to Philemon a runaway slave that's owned by Philemon named Onesimus. I'm probably saying it incorrectly. Remember, I grew up in West Virginia, so my pronunciation is often a little bit off. And so he's returning him because the runaway slave should go back to the master. But it's a very personal, very friendly letter. He's not critiquing Onesimus for running away. Some certain slaves ran away all the time in those days. They certainly ran away a lot here in the United States when we had slavery. And but the point of the letter is that Paul converted both Philemon and Onesimus to Christianity. And Paul was basically saying in a very polite, friendly way, gently, hey, this guy is now not just your slave or your servant, however you want to phrase it, but he's a fellow Christian. So you need to treat him as a brother, as a fellow Christian, not as he doesn't use these words, not as a subordinate type personality. And it's a very interesting moral question. When we were having our anti-slavery efforts in the 1840s and 1860s, the slave supporters would refer to various references like this in the New Testament defending slavery. But if you read it, it's really not a defense of slavery. It's trying to be proper, and it's also emphasizing to treat each other with love and gentleness and humility and kindness. And in our own slavery history, there was this weird complex where they treated them as subordinate, non-human people, but they sent pastors to convert them, to make Christians out of it. And I mean, it's one of the more interesting, nonsensical conflicts of American slavery. So that's really what this is. Very personal letter. Why this one was preserved and others weren't, I have no idea. Nobody really knows why these were preserved. But they were preserved and they were passed around. So it's very, very interesting. And it's fun to read. It's going to take you 5 minutes to read it. But look at it. This is not the Paul of 1 Corinthians where he's saying, you got to do this and you got to do this and you can't do that and you got to drive this person out. He's not saying that at all. He's gentle and loving and supporting. He's saying, hey, this guy's a fellow Christian now. Treat him like a brother, not like a servant. It's very interesting, very forward approach. He was more progressive on a lot of these social issues than we understand. Remember what I've said before, he had no interest in launching an anti-slavery campaign, having the Roman Empire jumped down his throat. He wasn't going there. He was trying to convert people to Christ, not to do all these social changes that we developed all these years later. And the anti-slavery movement did come out of British and North American Christianity. So that's where it came from. Now, Philippians is another letter, and it's my personal favorite, okay? And what you'll see as you get to the end of it, when we get there, is Paul is feeling his age. He's feeling fatigue. He's not despairing, but he's feeling the strain and stress of what had to be an extraordinarily difficult life. And he's feeling that, he's sharing that. So, and he's tired. And I understand that. I've been tired a lot. So if you ever have a situation, because you all will, I've had it. I've read this, probably the 4th chapter, 20 or 30 times. I had to do a lot of traveling in my career. It was very lonely. I carried a Bible with me, of course. When I'd have a bad or a long or a lonely day, I'd sit down and read the 3rd and 4th chapters of Philippians, and they would comfort and console me. So if you're ever in a situation, because we all have them, well, you need this, pull it out. You can read the 4th chapter or the 3rd and 4th, and it will console you. It's another prison letter, and the location is unclear. To me, it feels late in his career, which might be in Rome. Other people say it was in Ephesus, but we don't have a clear history of him being in prison in Ephesus. But he was in prison all over the place, so it wouldn't surprise me if it was like that. It's very different, so it's hard to tell exactly where he was. The letter is to the Philippians, which is over in Greece, on the east coast of Greece. And the debate over where this is because he makes a reference to being guarded by the Praetorium. Now, the Praetorian Guards were the imperial guards of the Roman Empire. They were headquartered in Rome, but they were based in the other major cities. So if he was being a prisoner in Ephesus or Athens or somewhere like that, they had Praetorian Guards there. So people dispute that. It just instinct-wise, and this is not science, this is instinct. It feels like Rome to me because he's getting toward the end. And so, the timing, like I said, isn't clear, the location isn't clear, but the Praetorian Guards were all throughout the empire. Traditionally, people put it at 55 to 57 AD. It feels later to me. And I would suspect it's in the Roman captivity, which is not exactly clear when those years were. It could have been as late as 62. He could have been executed between 64 and 67. Nobody really knows. We don't have any records because Acts has him arriving kind of in triumph in Rome as a prisoner, where he's converting the guards, etc., and it stops. So we really, really don't know. And so, like I said, this is my favorite letter. In chapter 3 and 4, he clearly shows that he's lonely and he's tired, and he has suffered grievously. There's no question. He's been flogged any number of times. He's been in prison any number of times. He wears chains, etc., etc. But his dedication to the message, which he realizes has punished him, that he's had to suffer for the message of Christ. He's been, like I said, flogged and arrested and this and that and the other. But he has no regrets. And he will continue to persevere. According to Acts, even in his Roman captivity, he was preaching to the guards and converting them. And so I read this section, like I said, regularly when I get tired and feel depressed, and I think you all can do that also. It says a couple things to me. It says it's okay to be tired. Because if you say, well, I'm never going to be tired, I think nonsense. We all get tired. So it's okay to be tired. But don't be despairing. Keep your faith. The Lord will provide. It may not be the way you want it. It may not be exactly what you think, but the Lord will provide in the Lord's own way. It's been traditionally been regarded by the scholars as an intact letter. It's only 4 chapters in our modern Bible. And I think it's an intact letter. Remember, Paul's letters, they have transitions, usually where we put the chapters in. Of course, they weren't chapters when they wrote the letters. They were added hundreds of years later. But when he has transitions, and he'll write a certain thing about this, then he'll switch to another topic, and that's where the chapters are. So people look at this and they try to say, well, some people are now saying this wasn't an intact letter because you have these breaks in the theme. I think the breaks in the theme are perfectly normal. Writing material was scarce and expensive. They didn't have a rapid postal service like we have. A lot of these letters were hand carried by Paul's followers. So it wouldn't surprise me that he would cover one theme, then he'd cover another theme, then he'd go back to a third theme, and then he'd wrap up. That makes perfect sense for writing as infrequently as he did, except we've had before no idea how many letters that were lost along the way. And so people have tried to cut it apart. They say that one of the sections is chapter 1, verse 1 through chapter 3, verse 1, and then throwing in chapter 4, 2 through 9, and 21 through 28. The second segment, they say, is chapter 3, verse 2 through chapter 4, 1, and the third segment is 4:10 through 4:20. This seems to me to be extreme, because it's unlikely they would have letters as short as 5 or 6 verses and cobble them all together. I think this is an intact letter. I think that there's a tendency in certain quarters to what I call torture the scriptures, to try to tear it apart for your own emotional reasons or for whatever. And that way you can find your own meaning out of it and other things like that. So I urge people to be careful about that. Some people don't like the term torturing the scriptures, but it's a case of just tearing it apart for your own emotional reasons. And I urge people not to do that. I think it's an intact letter. And so, therefore, that would place it among what are considered the great letters, Galatians, Romans, 1 Corinthians. And in this point, in chapter 1, he kind of laments his captivity. I don't blame him. He's committed to maintain his commitment to Christ. He's not going to change, but he clearly doesn't like being chained up again, and that's easy to understand. He laments that what he wants to do is go out and do the preaching and minister to his congregation, but he's going to go minister to the faithful, and stresses the proper to stress to the followers. He starts in here to stress what he's done before: lead the proper life. Don't be immoral. Don't be sinful. Don't be greedy. And that he worries about people that tend to want to divide the congregation, divide the faithful. And he stresses leading the proper life, being prayerful, being generous, and he stresses that the need to be loving, because if we're loving, we're going to be a lot less critical, and we're going to be loving, we're going to be a lot more generous, to maintain the humility in caring for the fellowship of the congregation, and to maintain Christ as your focus. In chapter 2, he says, in the form of God, in being in every way a human. So he's beginning to come. This is why I think this is later, because he hadn't really thought about how Jesus could be divine and human, or how much divine, how much human, early in his career, and that became an issue 300 years later in the 4th century. And I think he's hinting right there that he's beginning to understand that Jesus was both, as we describe him or believe him, fully God and fully man together. But it comes out only in his later letters. Here, Ephesians and Colossians is where it really comes out. So that's why I put it later letter, because he's beginning to understand this very complex nature about Jesus' nature. And he really pushes them, stay away from disunity, stay away from complaining, to maintain the community. And he is, then he reports that he's sending certain of his followers, Timothy, who was very close to him, and Epaphroditus, sorry, I can't pronounce it well, I can't read it from my notes very well, to support that congregation. In chapter 3, he warns them again against the Judaizers, as he calls them. Now, these are the people who came behind him. And this is a constant problem in his congregations, that he was allowed to convert the Gentile congregations, those who were pagans, who were not Jewish, to convert to Christianity, not force them to become Jewish first. Remember, in the early days of the church, when you're going back to 35 and 40, the traditional Galilean followers thought you had to be Jewish first and then put Jesus on top of it. And Paul's saying, no, Jesus came to relieve us of the law. The law only condemns us. So you don't want to be disobeying it flagrantly, but you don't really want to have to be Jewish again, which would mean getting circumcised, eating these very strict dietary laws, and also not associating with non-believers, because if you don't associate with non-believers, how are you going to bring them to Christ? You got to associate with other people. So it's the constant battle he's had with the Judaizers, and these are people who insist on legalism. He restates that his own particular Jewish background, born in the tribe of Benjamin, circumcised on the 8th day, a Pharisee of Pharisees. This is right in his own words. So when I tell the people that Paul was a Pharisee and a persecutor of the church, I know some people get shocked when I say that, but he was a persecutor of the church. He admitted it. He repented. He saw the error of his ways when Jesus appeared to him on the road to Damascus. And he's recognized that his salvation is not in the law, but it's through faith in Jesus Christ. And this is a very interesting conviction to us, because we do find modern churches struggling with how legalistic to be. There's an old joke in the country music thing about why Baptists don't make love standing up, because people will think they're dancing. It's kind of making fun of the prohibition against dancing. Now, there's no scriptural prohibition against dancing. It came out of the culture when the Baptist church emerged, which is about 1600. And in those days, a dance hall was a brothel. So the policy was put in to keep the young men out of the brothels. A good policy, makes sense. But nowadays, is it at all relevant? No, it's not really. Same thing with card playing, because card playing, which is very much forbidden in certain of the Baptist churches, was a way of gambling in the old days, but there's lots of non-gambling card games you can play now. And so, these things are tradition, but they're not scriptural. So the point is, how hung up on the legalism did you get? The law is love each other. The law is lead a moral life. The law is not be greedy, be generous, be humble, and without getting too hung up on the legalism. So, because the salvation comes from Jesus. And support the faithful that way without being legalistic and judgmental. Because if you're going to be legalistic, you often end up being judgmental. In chapter 4 is when he really gets into what supports me as an individual. He shows that in spite of all his suffering, in spite of all his fatigue, and his loneliness and his isolation, all those things coming from being in prison, always be joyful. Joyful in the Lord. Never worry about anything, but take care. Talk to God about all of your desires, and in prayer and with gratitude, and the peace of God, which is beyond all understanding, will be with you. I'm actually trying to quote it. I probably didn't quote it exactly. And our hearts and thoughts in Christ Jesus. So it's very important to remind us where we are, that even the greatest of the Christian evangelizers, Paul, got tired, got lonely. He didn't get discouraged, but he got tired. He was feeling the isolation of that. And finally he says how it is to find enough to find joy in the Lord. So it's very, very interesting. You're going to have days and weeks when you feel really down. Pick this up, read the 4th chapter. You can throw the 3rd in if you want. You can do it in a few minutes. Take a deep breath and go about your life. But remember, have your faith in the Lord. Pray about your problems and accept that. Be humble and loving in your lives and proceed on. So that's the message of this. You can see from my own enthusiasm, this is my favorite of the epistles, and I have used it many times, particularly when I had to travel a lot earlier in my career, and it was very lonely on the road. And so this has been my comfort, Philippians, particularly Philippians 4. So this is Dr. Guthrie. We'll stop here, and I'll see you all in another week.